Voy a hacerte co-host
porque no
también.
sé si no me acabo de hacer la prueba y no me guarda en el computador, creo.
Pruébalo ahora que ya estamos en el,
A ver.
ya eres co-host. Okay.
Ah, sí, ya.
Listo.
Ahora
Ok,
sí.
listo. Ok, entonces todos estamos listos para comenzar. Bienvenidas y bienvenidos a esta sesión de...
So we're ready to begin. So welcome to this session of the BioRegeneration Summit, Bioregional Regeneration Summit. We are today with Juliana Borges, with whom have been working very closely in this topic of biosystemic and this topic around how to bind the way of thinking that we're thinking about life systems with biosystemics, and this has been our exploration. Juliana Borges is an artist, Colombian artist, that has worked in systemic thinking for a long time now and has a very broad experience in working with communities, especially within the context of the armed conflict in Colombia. And she brings, from the systemic perspective, she brings possibilities to understand what is happening and about the conversations that can emerge in different contexts, such as possible ways to meet. So today, Juliana, welcome to this summit, and we will ask a small question to begin, and it's that within the space of application and working that you have been doing recently, we would like to hear a small anecdote about radical collaboration. How have you experienced perhaps a point of radical collaboration that might help us tune into that? Well, thanks a lot, Melina.
Quienes han trabajado por
here, who have worked in order to generate this summit and to open global and local spaces in this common purpose that we share for regeneration. So the people who know me know that this is an example that I have mentioned already in different spaces, but for me it's impossible that it's not the first example that jumps to my heart, mind, and body, and it's the example of the territorial construction of social transformation that the women have done in Colombia in the territories in the framework of the armed conflict. So in order to answer, I want to give some context. So these are mothers and grandmothers and sisters and cousins, women who are members of a community that have lost their homes, their lands, their children, their relatives, their husbands in the internal war situation. And an example that I find beautiful, and I bring it as an example, yes, because, and I think it's just a representation of so many movements that are happening in Colombia and the world, led by women that of course include men. And it is called City of Women. City of Women is a small city built in the north of Colombia, brick by brick, by women who have been displaced, drawn away by force of their territories, and have lost their children and relatives and husbands due to the violence. And they got together in what they call a little Colombia, a representation of life in which, without knowing each other, they got together and they initially got together in trying to find out how to bury one of them who had been killed by the armed forces. And in this process, they realized that they were able to do much more than that. And they have built a whole city now, as I say, brick by brick, against any expectation of the men who were around them. And today, I was recently, I was in that place, and I asked a young 12-year-old boy or young, why did you like to be here? And his answer was, I love to be here because I do not have to be violent here. And I think this is an example of radical collaboration that takes place based on the emergence of life and of the intelligence and that we are alive. Because I think that in human systems, a big part of what happens is that we forget that we are alive, we forget that we are nature, and therefore our intelligence does not adapt to the harmony of the well-beings of the systems, of the different living systems. And this is an example in which intelligence goes beyond
the situations, the emotional and critical situations, psychological critical situations that violence entail. It's an example of the intelligence as a species and of survival joined with growth. There are two meta principles that I'm going to mention later on, surely, today, and of resilience, but especially, I think, of radical collaboration. Well, thanks a lot, Juliana. How deep is what you share? And I think this example actually shows the potential that exists. And I would like to give you now also the space so you could also share how come you have gotten involved in this. How is the perspective of seeing the systems and working with communities? So I invite you to share with us and to tell us, how did this arise for you? Yes, Melina. And I also want to introduce Melina, because this is certain kind of order that also emerges moment after moment. Because in this space, Melina and me are, on one hand, Melina is kind of moderating, but we are also opening this space and sharing it as partners, as allies and co-creators of this that we did, that is called biosystemics. So I also want to introduce Melina in this way, who I've known for several years already, who has been working from biomimesis. And this introduction that I do is very important because for me, the main thing, and here we begin to talk about biosystemics already, the main thing is to, first off, to define the contexts, to understand the different contexts, socio-ecologic and social ecologic and of any other sorts of aspects of socio-ecology. So Melina from biomimicry, in her experiences of working in different systems, and I coming from systemic thinking and working also at the level of, especially in the context of the armed conflict in Colombia, in processes of social transformation and reconciliation. We met outside of the academy initially. We met based on our purpose of contribution, to see what each one was doing and to find points in common. So, and I think this is my first invitation in this space. So it is a question that I think we must ask ourselves in the different systems that we inhabit and that to which we belong, and is the difference are definite. And we have lately been talking a lot about biodiversity and how diversity defines us from the perspective of life. However, in the level of social and human systems, we need to remember more, what do we have in common? What is not separating us? So finding these points in common with Melina, we ended up co-creating a master's degree in the Externado University of Colombia that we called Transdisciplinary Masters in Sustainable Life Systems. And from there, we started to, thanks to the transdisciplinary approach, we started to bring together the systemic thinking areas and biomimicry from the cross-disciplinarity. So it means that not only from the approach of the disciplines they represent, but much beyond that. And for this, what we started to do is a program in which we created projects in Colombia led by the students themselves and the participants of the masters, from which we started to apply the principles of life systems and the principles of systems, systemic principles aimed at applying them in these projects with a regenerative purpose. And based on this exercise that we started to work together on with Melina, we started to create the approach of biosystemics. And I'm going to show you the principles of the model that we use. We're not going to go too deep into how we use them, but we do want to introduce them, present them, and we're going to ask some questions later. So in this global network, we can have joint introspections, joint inquiries in order to see how we can improve our practices, recalling, for example, and giving the systemics a place within what bio-inspiration is. So I know that many of the people who are here know about systemic thinking, so maybe I'm going to repeat some things that might be obvious for some of you, but that I think it's good to mention them anyway. So for example, it's key to remind that the systemic thinking comes from life thinking. If we think about it beyond Banterlamfi, we can find that all the reflections of the principles that today we call systemic principles come from reflections about life. And Bartelamfi was a biologist that also was kind of a philosopher. And in the boost of science, in the midst of so much importance that science had back then, being philosopher was not profitable. So he devotes himself to biology, but he never loses his real vocation as a philosopher. And that took him to ask himself the questions that he was not asking himself or addressing from science. So what he asked himself was, why does this heart that I am studying, how come the context of the organism doesn't have a relevance to the heart, the anatomical heart that I'm studying? And finally, all of these reflections lead to the importance of connections and the other systemic principles such as limits, belonging, connecting. So he starts to state a deep reflection inside of his scientific studies in order to be able to determine new methods and new conditions to study life. So systemics actually come from a reflection based on observation and of contemplation of life and towards adding inputs here. So when I studied systemics from different perspectives, with people such as Peter Senge and Otto Scharmer, or from organizational therapies such as Jan Jacob Stam or constellations or many other disciplines and aspects, and from education also. Something that I started to realize was that when one arrived to systemics, somehow one could get lost somehow. I learn a systemic method, but I forget about the origin of the systemic thinking as such. So part of what we have done is how to return to finding the origin where systemics were born and connecting it to the life principles. So I wonder, Melina, if you want to contribute something in this moment. I'm going to share my screen also in order to introduce how we have provided order to all of this thinking and working that we have done together, and that offer or frames somehow what we have been doing here in Colombia and also in other parts of the world. Yes, I would like to supplement telling that we had this old process within systemics of going back to the principles on the origin based on living systems. Biomimicry also reappears within the framework of what we could call designing products or designing industrial processes or architectural design, bringing knowledge about the strategies, the biological strategies of how organisms have solved problems or challenges of their environment, such as how to handle water, solar radiation, friction, sound waves, etc., by handling and behaving in certain ways in their surroundings in order to generate adaptive strategies that enables them to, for example, reduce friction or collect moisture from the water, etc. So biomimicry, in that intent to take a very conscious look at the nature to understand how it behaves and which are the patterns that are behind, it takes to or comes to developing the life principles. It's kind of general patterns that are found in life. Now, from biology, from conventional or mainstream biology, the patterns that emerge are patterns that do not necessarily include the subjective experience of the living being. So what I do with life principles when I start to work with them, trying to apply them to social systems, is an adaptation, because as such, they do not work to be applied to social systems, because social systems include us from inside, from within. We are included there, so we always have an internal perspective. So the biology that I used, or my background in theoretical biology and cognitive biology and quantum biology, helped me understand those patterns from within. And the conjunction with Juliana was to realize that the possibility that those patterns that we observed in life from the internal perspective matched perfectly with what systemics was trying to do and with the systemic patterns. So what we did was basically to start to play with them, to put them on top of the table, and to see how in all of the processes of application they were colluding. So what we're going to introduce is really the sum of this of the work that we have been doing with communities based on all of this. So I'm going to share my screen, and can you see it? Yes. Good. So what we did was, as Melina said, we connected, or we brought in the life principles and matched them through processes that we have already spoken about. We connected them to the systemic principles in order to find how to work with the former for processes not only of design, such as is done, for example, in biomimicry, but also of articulation and analysis, and in order to impact processes of dynamics and transformation of patterns. So we have these principles. This is our biosystemics model, through which we navigate with the principles of life and the systemic principles. And we have 3 levels of principles that we consider fundamental in the roadmap of for work here. We have the flourishing principles, the strengthening principles, and the vital principles. And it is through the initial work with the vital principles what we checked with the different social ecological systems is we checked or reviewed which is the initial balance in vital terms to work upon the structures, the existing structures, towards harmonization of life in the existing orders, or to strengthen the dynamics and patterns that we acknowledged. It is very important, and something I want to highlight is that we started by vitality, our own vitality, because it's key that the first thing we ask, and I think this is part of the findings that we have reached in working with communities, and maybe I will show this back again in a moment, but I'm gonna stop sharing in order to see each other. So the fundamental work that we have found is that often we want to transform the systems or go towards new tendencies without first gathering what we already have. And what we have seen is that most of the systems have a strong vital potential. Maybe in many parts of their operation, there are patterns that due to tendencies or trends or due to the transformations and changes in the world, we want to take new paths, or maybe situations emerge that makes us move. But it's common that when we transform systems, when we have the intention of changing things or transforming something inside the systems, it's not common that we first gather what we have in terms of vitality. And I think this is one of the reflections that is key for regeneration, and it's the difference precisely between the tendencies of sustainability and the ones of regeneration. And it is that there's nothing is wrong. And for the ones who work with systemics and bioinspiration understand, and it is that life just is, and we should acknowledge it as such. It's kind of taking a step back and starting from contemplation and from harnessing what there is, what is. And sometimes even in the worst situations, and for example, I come back to the question that Melina asked initially about radical collaboration. So now that I'm speaking, I think about one of those situations in which there is very few vitality left when you are seeing how life of your dear ones is being taken away by the armed forces. So if we think in those situations, vitality seems to be very small. But even in those situations, the greatest strength is that whatever is being rescued from vitality. It's not starting from coming from where do we want to go, what do we want to transform, or where are we coming from, but from the most intimate and deep sense of survival. And survival in the territory is determined by water. Water is the main element here. So part of our invitation, because we also think based on ancestral thinking, from which a large part of our trajectory comes from, is to come back to thinking not about Earth, but seeing ourselves or acknowledging ourselves as Earth and recalling the principle behind the principles, and to having an initial relationship with the territories in which we ourselves are not facilitators and consultants, but we are part of life, and we are standing in the life. We are part of the life that we are observing. So it is kind of meeting outside or finding outside what is inside. So I highlight this example of water because who knows a lot about, for example, in hydrological terms or territorial or geographic terms, can understand even much better than myself what I am talking about. But we often read it in aesthetic manner or in technical manner, sorry, and we do not let ourselves be surprised by the experience of the water flows in the territory because where there's life, where there's water, there's life. And that has to do with those vital principles. And when I talk from the territorial perspective, I must also mention it from the social and human perspectives. And it's that our emotion is part, Our emotions are a key part if we want to regenerate systems. If we want to regenerate them, we are not our sight, in our work is biocentric, and we don't have the stance of considering that we are doing the job or the work. In fact, we have a project in Cachantiva, Boyacá, some primary oak forest reserves that we have been applying all these processes upon those forests in the regeneration processes. And I honestly think that when I spoke about water, I must also mention emotions and the ways of relating, because it is in the social aspects where we can see how our relationships are. The way our relationships are is the consequence of how we are relating to Earth and to our own bodies. So it is not real that we technically have the knowledge on how to connect intimately with the ecosystems if our human ecosystems are not healthy. So I think that this correlation is the radical collaboration to which I also invite myself and the one that I feel with the forest. I think that those forests take more care of me than how I take care of them. But we take care of each other. So what a beautiful way to bring this, Juli. And thinking in terms of the whole summit, I would like for everybody here to establish a relationship. And it is that often we just stay contemplating or looking at the whole destruction that the system we are embedded in has created, and that the discussions that we can have are always ending up in saying, no, well, the problem is such and such, and this is not useful, and multinationals or whatever. And the sensation that I have experienced in other conversations, and these conversations with you, have to do with how we rescue those points of real vitality and that happen and that we are experiencing, that we are feeling, in order to connect ourselves with the emergence of life again, with the regeneration. And here I would like to say that regeneration is, within this context, is to recover those flows of vitality. For me, the example that you bring of women, of the city of women, they regenerated themselves through that radical collaboration and through that process in which they are able to continue living, and thriving. So it's to pay close attention to what life is, and that enables us to have self-regulation processes, which is one of the vital principles that is among all of us, to be able to tell ourselves, hey, we are already falling into talking about everything that's wrong, but this is not what we need in this case. No, we already set the context. Let's now regenerate from a different place, or let's accept silence, because we are often wanting to fill in the silence or the spaces when we have too many things to say, or we have not felt heard, that our needs are heard enough, or listened to enough, and we forget about satisfying those needs for ourselves, regarding taking that step back and taking distance and letting ourselves just be Earth, and letting ourselves listen what emerges as life presents itself. And then we are able to follow it and to say, hey, what was said over here was wonderful. Let's follow this path. So kind of continue building brick after brick the bioregeneration process. Yeah, and I would like something else, short, brief. Listening to you, Melina, I would like to remind that we both recall something that is, I think it's important for both of us, and that has a place. It's not by chance. I think that it has been spoken a lot of systemics and biomimicry around the world. And the fact that two Colombian women bring this, want to bring this concept of biosystemics and want to contribute from this idea of going back to the origin and observing and preserving life is not by chance. It's not by chance that this happens in a Latin American context in Colombia. And I think that's important. And I love to be able to be speaking in English in this space, though this is not like a very important, I mean, this is not a big issue for me, languages, but it is important anyway. And it makes a lot of sense that we are women without saying that men cannot be here also, because one thing does not exclude the other. But yes, there is a very important topic here. And it is that what had to happen for me to listen to life, and what had to happen for my knowledge, my theoretical knowledge, for example, in the case of Juliana Borges, my knowledge about systemics would not be prioritized upon my observation and my relationship with life. And I believe that what for us is most important to bring, or the reason for which is most important to bring biosystemics, is not to create a new approach and then have a higher theoretical or academic position, but instead biosystemics is an invitation not to forget where we are coming from. And that academy and that the processes that we perform in terms of facilitation, intervention, and consulting, that we always stand first upon or coming from the vital principles and life principles and flourishing and strengthening. And I wanted to mention this because when we know the difficulties of life systems that experience or that are so complex, such as here in Colombia, or in Colombia where we have been working, not because we're Colombians, but because we have been working for a long time in these contexts due to our reality. This emerges as needs, as a need for an approach. And with this, I mean, what is me as a human being? How do I need to stand, or what does my stance need to be in order to collaborate together? So that's what I wanted to say. Very well, so I want to open the space in case there are people who want to ask questions about this brief introduction of biosystemics. What questions may come to you? You know, which are the topics that emerge in you? So you can raise your hand if you have a question and we will listen to you.
Y quizás yo diría, si no hay preguntas también, si alguien...
Maybe I would add, if there are no questions, I would like to ask if somebody has an insight, perhaps something, all of this is also welcome. So Tricia, welcome.
Primero, muchísimas gracias. Sí,
Lots of introspection, yes. Thanks a lot. You generated lots of introspection and insights, and beyond that, like a strong feeling of, yes, it's like complexity and harmony and a lot of sense. And I also felt from the women here with whom I have the honor of working, they know this. They have this intuition about how things work. And with one of these, I was last night with one of these women. She's connected online with to a class to raise her capacity of being a communitary weaver. And she is already a communitary weaver, and she thinks about this role. And anyway, she's there. So I wonder how we can provoke and show for a person such as her How can we show her that she has already that is part of her system? Like, hey, you already have all the elements and tools that you need to continue, and how you can um, recognize that you have that wisdom, acknowledge it. That's what the reflections these provoke in me. There are many thoughts here. Thanks a lot for sharing this, and that was what I would like. I wanted to share this. Thank you, you beautiful women. Thank you, Trisha. And it's also wonderful, Trisha, that you bring the example of your work in Costa Rica with women, and two words that you mentioned that I want to highlight. One of those is the endemic knowledge that you call wisdom, and it's precisely that. We often seek for resources of knowledge outside, and I think that when we talk about regeneration, the time for searching outside is over. Everything is inside. It's all inside, and that's wisdom. And I want to supplement that among the biosystemic vital principles, the ones that are more towards the center, that the ones who cannot be disregarded or misregarded, and the ones that are going to let us know how the system is in vital terms. One of those is that the system is able to acknowledge to itself from the essence. And when this principle is missing, there is a need of going into a pathway of being able to acknowledge abundance. Some time ago here in Costa Rica, in an island, the community living there told me that they were poor. And I told them, how can you consider that you are poor? Just shut off your television and you're going to see the whole abundance you have, because the TV is telling you what you don't have. So you feel poor. But if you shut off the television and focus in what you have, there are fruits falling down from the trees. There are kind neighbors. There is people that's coming to visit and bring some things. So there is a process of collaboration. It's an amazing island. So given that the roadmaps that biosystemics offer are to start to think what we would need to strengthen, or to find what we would need to strengthen, such as that, how is abundance generated or acknowledged, in order to be able to reconnect to your essence. So what we're offering is, if there is something that is weak in a system, the biosystemic approach helps you see other perspectives that are going to complete or supplement or strengthen that point of vitality that is low. So in this example that Trisha brought, that would be the approach. I wonder if there's maybe another person that would like to share what is coming to you with these reflections.
Marcela.
Sí, pues me surge.
Marcela.
¿Alguien más iba a hablar?
Yes, was somebody else gonna speak? Yeah, so Elvira, Indira had raised her hand. So I wonder if Marcela wanted. Okay, so Marcela and then Elvira.
Vale, pues me
Good.
surgen
So
muchas inquietudes
some
sobre
questions come to
pues
me
cómo funciona, obviamente cosas que
regarding
no se alcanzan a cubrir en la llamada, pero cómo
many things
funciona
work. Maybe we cannot cover
ese
this
marco de
in this
referencia
conversation,
para
but how
poder
does this reference
dar
framework
cuenta de la
in order
vitalidad del
to
sistema y de
realize
esos puntos que no están
which
tan
is the
vitales y
vitality of the
cómo llevar
systems,
esa
and to
vitalidad?
realize
Y
the
pues
points that are
me
not
quedo
so
muy
vital, and how
interesada como
to
en poder
take
conocer
vitality
más.
to those
Entonces,
points. I am
como
interested in
entiendo que es
knowing more
un
about that,
asunto
and
amplio que
given
no
that
se cubre en
I
una
understand
llamada,
that
me
is a
gustaría
broad
entender a ver si hay
topic
otros
that we cannot
espacios que
cover here.
estén
I would like to understand
profundizando
if
en
there are
este tema
more
para poderlo
spaces that
comprender más
in which I
ampliamente.
can go deeper into this topic and understand it in a broader way. Thanks a lot, Marcela. Well, in some spaces we are opening, as we said, we work in some universities jointly where we are working with people who are doing regenerative projects. And we also have some spaces that we are opening within the framework of Colombia Regenerativa from the organizations from which we work, and we are partners. That is Merakis' lab with Melina, and from that place, we're also going to offer some spaces. And for those who are not, they don't have projects in Colombia, we also, if it's okay, I am going to write an email and in the chat, and you can get in touch with us. And our main intention, and thanks Marcela for your interest, is precisely to weave and to put this out and apply it and put it in service, put in service what we have been applying and learning in our own projects, not only in the territorial interventions in Colombia, but also in our own projects, in our own project in which we have realized about the importance and how this approach helps us in life. Yes, and I would also, in life process, yeah, and I would also like to say that something that emerges has been emerging in these 2 or 3 days of summit that we have already been through is simultaneous interpretation that I consider is fantastic, because often many of the things that we have done are in Spanish, and it seems that there are also lots of people who speak English that want to be that want to approach and to come closer and have access to what we have to what has been taking place in the Hispanic world. So to be able to have simultaneous interpretation is something that we are going to explore much more in depth as a way to do to make it accessible to more people in a much easier way. So good. I wanted to add that also there. And Erendira, did you want to say something? Yes, thank you, Juliana and Belina. And it's really, so I'm enjoying this a lot. I have interpreted Juliana before in the Awakening the Fields, and but I was actually listening to both of you, and it's amazing how when Juliana, when you said what had to happen for me to listen to live, and this took me back to a moment in which I was walking in the forest, and when you were talking, this was vibrating, in me. I was feeling vibration because I started to see something that I hadn't seen before, a manner that I hadn't seen before. And what you mentioned about what had to happen for me to listen to live is from where did I need to see in order to be able to see the whole forest or to see my life from a place that I hadn't seen it before at my 51 years. And I spoke about it today at a meeting I had, and it was like I I entered into such an essential shock, an existential shock, that there is where you mentioned about vitality and flourishing and the system that takes you to realizing that richness and abundance. And then I come back to that moment in which I said, I haven't seen anything about my life. And to acknowledge afterwards, after the shock, to acknowledge, oh my God, yes, I have lived, and yes, I have seen. And that is what I can say. Like, I didn't know it. I was not aware of that. I hadn't seen it. Or from what new place can I see it? And it's seeing everything that is being done through regeneration. It's that, And I just want to thank you and sharing this, that it's not always easy because it's easier for me to do it from the business side, but from here is like that vulnerability that makes that vibration to exist and the thriving. Thanks a lot. Thanks. It's a real pleasure to see you here again, Erendira. Yeah, so beautiful. Juan Sebastián. So hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here sharing with you.
Native language. Un gusto,
So it's a
Melina.
pleasure, Melina. With Melina, I have already been having a conversation for some time already in a bioregional process here in the territory, or the bioregion that I inhabit in Colombia. It's the northern part of Antioquia, and I have told Melina that it's been a very enriching process. We are just beginning, and we are here working for ways of understanding precisely the territory and how it is defined by its basins and rivers and forests. And we are in a pedagogic process in a territory that is still influenced and surrounded by a culture of cattle growing, traditional cattle growing and traditional agricultural industry. So we are working on this. And so that's a point. Juliana, I have been following you for some time now already, also as an eco-social promoter and systemic promoter. And I would like to have this as a channel to continue sharing experiences and learning and incentivizing collaborative work, because I've also been working for some time already precisely from the systemic perspective, understanding the organizations as living beings, speaking beings, reflexing, and inclusive and interdependent beings. So there we share that purpose. But the observation or reflection that I want to share and what I take away from this speech or this conversation that you have shared here is how regeneration essentially is an act of love, understanding love as the main condition precisely for the flourishing of life. So what we are doing as regenerative designers, at least in my case as an apprentice, because more than
Considero un aprendiz
more than
constante.
anything else, I consider I am a permanent student of this topic of generation of life. There is the essential point, precisely how regeneration, and for the ones who work for regeneration work for love, and not understanding love from a sentimental or marketing perspective or consumerist perspective that we have taken on due to an anthropocentric traditional education, but precisely how as a process to strengthen or galvanize life. And another one of the processes that I consider important to share is because here, maybe here in this group, as you mentioned, Juliana, we can already have an understanding, basic or a little bit more complex of the systemic topic. But I think there's a great opportunity in language, because we're not only going to talk here about the 0.01%, but we have to take this conversation also to people and mindsets that maybe are very different than this, or that do not have the opportunity of understanding this. So there's an opportunity regarding language and how we also start to look at, because talking about organizations as living beings, in fact, there is an influence, or the word organization comes from the organum, Latin term, which means tool, work tool, a working tool. So it has an mechanistic origin. So how from our systemic action, regenerative action, we can also influence the language used in organizations and in companies. How can we change different terminologies? For example, strategy is one of the most used terms, and in the classical theory of administration and management brought in many terms from war. from war and from mechanistic perspective. So from biology, we can also start to introduce some terms also in the way in the way organizations and companies speak that reconnect us to those living principles. So I also wanted to ask you what you think about this, such an important topic of language. Well, thanks a lot. And first of all, Erendira, I wanted to mention and highlight part of what you say. It's also, for me, it's also key to connect us between ourselves in these processes we want to do. So there's something you said that was regarding remembering the learnings from life. Now, this question of what have we learned in life, and for this, there's something that I would like to share, and it is, I don't know, maybe here there are some people who have had a situation of what Picola Esteves calls life, death, life processes in which one faces for issues of health or violence or whatever, one faces death. And there's a moment in which that happens. I have gone through it. And there is a moment in which that happens, in which that story, they tell that the whole life passes in front of you in a second. I have experienced that, and I remembered, Erendira, when you mentioned this, I recalled that, and I think it's key to bring that into these moments where we want to give a different opportunity, because it's not about transforming life or changing life, but giving ourselves a different opportunity in life. And when do we do it? When life passes as a train in front of us, and we say, oh my God, and what appears the most, what we did not do is what appears the most. So that the moment to remember ourselves, remind ourselves what we are, and learn from our own life is now. The moment is now, not wait for that moment to come in which life is up here and to look down here, to wanting this that we have, that this is the first life system, your own, with which we relate. So, and Juan Sebastian, thanks for your reflection about language. For me, it is key to be able to come back to the origin of language, the etymology. People who know me know that I am a fan of this, because we have gotten lost in words. And I think it is key, as you said, organization comes from a mechanicistic vision and a utilitarian vision. However, organism does not, and they share the root. So I think that part of the invitation that I bring is to start to see what we see as an organization, start to see it as an organism, because they share a root, but we have forgotten that within the organization there is life, and that's why we made it mechanicistic. So that takes us to the deep need with which we started to speak, and is that we should remind that we are alive, and it's difficult because for all, I mean, and I'm not going to make up that I have never forgotten it. We have all forgotten this, and that is part. And also want to thank you, Juan Sebastian, for two concepts, key concepts and words that you brought, and was learning. We're learning all the time, because unfortunately enough, because whoever knows everything will get bored, and love. And I think that part of resignifying language has to do with incorporating what we have rejected because we do not give value to it. And for example, with Melina, we talked about this in the classes and in the ecosystems that we visit. Where do we find love, or where is love seen or found? But it's also key when we talk about transformation and love to give it the place that it really has. And transformation itself is not beautiful, nor love is easy. Love is not like, hey, we're going to say that we all love each other. No, love is the most powerful aspect of love is when it doesn't flow in exclusions. Acknowledging my need of exclusion, for example, if I acknowledge it, or acknowledging it is perhaps one of the highest forms of love in society, not including acknowledging my difficulty to connect and excluding intentionally. So in a forest, love lies within connection. There is where everything flows, but when it flows, it flows. The point is not here like, okay, what has happened, and I have seen it a lot in the gatherings, and is we bring love when it is kind of easy, you know, when we want to hug each other, well, there it flows. We do not need it, you know, then to flow as such. We do not need to make an effort, but we need to bring love to where there is no connection, to where it doesn't flow. And love does not mean that everything is beautiful in life. In life, beauty, and I say this as an artist also, beauty is a very intimate quest of an order that I have not reached yet. And it is a fundamental reconciliation with chaos, understanding chaos as the great opportunity to find those new orders. So I want to thank everything that you bring through your interventions, because that's the way we weave. There's nothing, and here I'm going to talk plurally, because here Melina and I we are one. There is nothing that we know that you don't know. Each of us brings an order to information, or nests information in their own way, and has the opportunity of connecting and binding and contributing mutually, and that's our purpose. And it is a purpose that the most important thing here is that it has led us to meeting each other in contribution, and to give a place to diverse languages, finding points in common, in which we do not need to compete, but where, on the contrary, collaboration reaches an infinite level of richness. And from there is from where we stand when we share biosystemics. I am Colombian, however, I have kind of, I look kind of German. Due to respect, I have been trying to be very disciplined and be careful with time, and try to end on time. That's why I say I'm kind of German also. So this space was set for an hour, and we would love to share much more. And I left my email in the chat, 2 emails, just in case. Please get in touch with us, and we want to continue getting together. And I want to express appreciation again to all the whole organization that makes this possible. Andres for interpreting, that we had already been in other spaces, and Melina, of course, and of course you, Melina, and to all the people who are here. Thanks, Juliana, and thanks to myself, and thanks to everybody for having listened or for having been connected here. And thanks, Andres, for having interpreted, for the English speakers that so kindly are letting Spanish have a strong presence and are being open to this. And we are gonna stop recording in this moment in the session. So you can all finish your recordings.